But if you haven't seen that, not to worry, I'll give a very brief explanation of it. And I know, as Seb said, some of you may have already participated in some of our poetry that we did over the first year or so of the pandemic. What we're doing, this may sound very odd, research and poetry don't really go together often very well, but what we'd like to do, what we're trying to do is to understand people's experiences of different rare forms of dementia through the use of poetry. And poetry has been used in dementia work, support work for many, many years, but it has not been done in rare forms of dementia. So what we're asking you to do today as part of the group, we're going to be going to all of the severe dementia support groups throughout this year that RDS supports. And you're the first ones here that we're starting with. And we'd like you to participate by giving us your words. In front of you or on your seat, there's a piece of paper. And we'd like you to respond to one or two questions. And I'll just read those for you. Is how does this support group support you as someone living with PCA or as a care partner for someone living with PCA? You can write one word, 2 words, a sentence. It doesn't even have to be a complete sentence with verbs and adjectives and nouns. It can be anything you want. This is poetry. So just those words. Or if this is new, if you're new, this is the first time you've been to the meeting, or you're very new to RDS, there's a related question. If you are new to this group, how would you like the group to support you? What support do you need from the group? Now what will happen is that we'll collect your responses when you write them on this piece of paper at lunchtime, or if you've done beforehand and you want to give them to one of us, that's fine. They will be collected and given to our consulting poet, Lawrence Wilson, who will take your words and create one or more poems. Considering how many people are here today, there may be more than one poem or verses of one poem. And those poems will be collected and sent back to you along with your original words. So it is a collective voice of poetry. Most poetry, as we know, is probably written by one author, one voice. This is going to be a collective voice of people with different forms of dementia, in this case PCA, and carers who are supporting people with PCA. At the break, or before the break, sorry, I'll be happy to answer any questions. But at the end of the year, you'll be getting a collected volume, it'll be a PDF we'll send to everyone of all the poems collected throughout this year from the different rare dementia support groups as a thank you for participating. I just want to add one thing. You don't have to participate in this today. If you feel that you don't want to write any words down, that's completely fine. There's no pressure to do it. We really welcome your involvement, but again, it's really your choice. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. And just to stress, we won't apologise for the fact that in addition to PCA, 3 words that you'll be hearing again and again today are support, education and research. And that's because that's what Rare Dementia Support's all about, and we want to put your voices and your experiences at the heart of all of those things, not just finding out ways to support you and for you to support each other, but also collectively and communally for us to be educating people, raising awareness about what PCA is, countering some of the stereotypes around dementia, which I'm sure many of you face on a daily basis, but also learning more about PCA and understanding not just the biology of it, but how it affects you in your everyday lives. And that's a great example of how to get involved in that. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Robert Adams to the stage. Robert is a long-standing member of the support group, and I think he will explain what he's going to be talking about, but I think it's most important for me to emphasise that Robert's standing here not as a member of the sort of UCL or UCLH clinical staff, but as someone who has lived the experience of a loved one with PCA is vital for these groups. We want the information not just to come top down, but for you to feel like you are leading this group, being involved, sharing what's important to you. And so we're really grateful, Robert, for you to come in, for coming and being the first speaker today.
You haven't heard what I've got to say.
I'm grateful for the moment.
Thank you so much. So I wasn't sure about the mic, but apparently we've got the mic. Thank you very much for that introduction, Seb. see eager, anticipatory faces. I'm not sure I'm going to live up to the trailer, but we'll see how we go. It's also quite weird, I'm finding, that the last 2 years I've been on PCA meetings, and below the waist I've just been wearing shorts. I wasn't sure what to wear. And I didn't realise how tall Seb was. So it's a privilege to be invited to talk to you today, and forgive me, I'm going to use notes so that there's some coherence to what I'm going to say, because I did this before and I realised I was repeating myself, which is also a trend with PCA. So what is PCA? As a layperson, I shall give you my overview in simple terms of what posterior cortical atrophy, which we know as PCA, is. And I'll intersperse this with my lived experience of the effects of the disease in caring for my late wife, Catherine, who developed PCA in her journey. I shall talk about the things we noticed that impacted Catherine's life as her illness progressed, and share some of our strategies for coping with everyday living. And I do realise that many or most of you today here are already aware of PCA and already may have the diagnosis, but it may be helpful to give you some context to our journey. And I apologise in advance if this sounds all too familiar and possibly gloomy. At the end, I'm hoping it won't be. What I don't want to do is to make you feel miserable about what may lie ahead. And I must emphasise, and Seb will back this up, I'm sure, that not everyone with a diagnosis of PCA will typically experience what we did. But I'll tell you about our journey anyway, and you can make your own judgment of how that knowledge may affect you. Great as it is to be here today, because you're not on Zoom, you can't just lock me off and go away. So PCA is among a more rare form of dementia. It is a disease of the brain. It is clinically defined as a neurodegenerative syndrome, and the condition is essentially characterized by a progressive and relatively selective decline in one's higher visual processing ability and other posterior cortical functions. And because the symptoms of PCA often first present as visual impairment, it's not uncommon for PCA to be misdiagnosed as a physical disorder of the eyes and of one's vision. So PCA is principally the decay of cells in the posterior cortical regions of the brain, i.e. at the back of the head, which is where signals from what we see are processed. And it can be, but it's not so in every case, associated with posterior Alzheimer's disease. Typically, onset may occur between age 50 to 65. What it is not, as I soon came to realise, is a condition that is readily diagnosed. Still today, it's been confused with poor eye health, fading eyesight in someone visiting an optician with perceived visual deficiency. They may be expecting to need corrective surgery or prescription lenses to overcome this. And this is a spoiler alert, and possibly a big disappointment to you. I'm not a clinician, nor am I a health professional, nor am I an expert in why we get PCA disease, or its specific diagnosis, or its clinical progression. There are several highly qualified clinicians, academic researchers, and other knowledgeable experts in the room here today, and all those specialising in the Dementia Research Centre in Queen Square who can tell you about that in much more detail. However, my knowledge about PCA and the effects of this ultimately debilitating condition, which enable me to speak more generally about it, is from 11 years of caring for Catherine, my wife, with her dementias. She died from it on New Year's Day 2 years ago, aged just 70, after 6 days rapid decline over the Christmas period. At the start of our journey, Catherine underwent some 4 years of sporadic investigation into her feeling unusually unwell. She was very full of life normally. This prolonged diagnostic period was very frustrating. She attended a variety of clinics, undergoing many tests to establish why she was feeling constantly exhausted, with severe neck and head pain, with transient episodes of feeling faint and fitting, and having some perceived vision issues. And she generally struggled to cope with everyday living and was signed off work. Tests culminated in her needing an operation at the back of her skull to relieve restriction of the flow of spinal fluid to the brain. She recovered well, but then she collapsed after some seizures and resulted in being implanted with a dual chamber pacemaker. She and her GP and I thought this would fix her run of poor health. However, Catherine continued to have further debilitating headaches, found reading and viewing TV more challenging, and she was prescribed lots of different glasses for her everyday vision and for reading. But this did not resolve her feeling unwell with increased distress and low mood. In late 2011, she was diagnosed with probable young-set Alzheimer's. She was 62. I emphasise the word probable because Catherine could not then undergo an MRI scan to confirm the various findings more conclusively because of her pacemaker. The diagnosis of typical Alzheimer's disease came as a complete surprise to us both. Because of that uncertainty and lack of scans, the local neurologist referred Catherine for more extensive and specialised cognitive assessment for younger onset patients, and she attended several clinics at the National Neurological and Neurosurgery Hospital here in London, and she willingly joined their research, including genetic testing. This more specialist exploration culminated in Catherine getting confirmation of typical Alzheimer's disease, but surprise, surprise, it also indicated the development of PCA, which became evident in late 2016, some 8 years since she first became unwell. I, and she, I guess, had absolutely no knowledge of this more rare condition at the time, nor of its imperceptible but growing effects. But undoubtedly for us, PCA became the dominant feature of Catherine's last 4 years of life, and the Alzheimer's and her gradual loss of memory became less significant. During my caring for Catherine at home, and for her last 19 months whilst assisting her care in a nursing home, I gained further insight into PCA, and I developed an interest in sharing our experience, primarily to help other people on this journey through the often daunting challenges that PCA brings. PCA is more properly defined clinically, and I quote, as an uncommon early onset dementia characterized by progressive visuospatial dysfunction and topographical disorientation, unquote. But in other simple words, a patient with PCA cannot determine the meaning of some or all categories of previously known non-verbal visual stimuli, despite having normal visual perception, pretty good eye health, and an intact alertness, attention, and intelligence. In the early stages of PCA, memory and insight typically remain relatively intact, but the person's impaired vision is not to be confused with compromised eyesight or poor eye health. It's better considered as the effect of the disease upon what we can refer to, and Seb introduced me to this word, a person's brain sight. Some common indicators of the condition include having difficulty with one's reading and writing, often finding spelling difficult and forgetting the shape or name of letters, being unable to judge distances and depths, or distinguish objects of different shapes, colours, and the texture of materials. And an increasing lack of spatial awareness of one's general surroundings makes crossing roads, using stairs, and particularly managing escalators difficult, especially when judging when to step off the end onto the stationary surface. It can be a real struggle to identify normal things in everyday living. Shapes may appear unusually distorted, or might look as though they're moving when they're actually stationary. And familiar objects, unfortunately, will become less recognisable. To a person with PCA, some things may appear to have an unusual colour, but that person may not be colourblind. And depth and field of vision may become compromised. It may be a struggle to see objects out of the corner of their eyes, or they will see several things that are stood together as being just one. Catherine developed a real problem with her peripheral vision, and physically her eyes began to diverge when she was tired. So anyone approaching silently from behind her or to her side without giving warning by speaking in advance used to really spook her. So just for example, if you do that with your fist and look through, you'll get some idea of what you can't see beyond the hole. To a person with PCA, a dark puddle might look like a hole in the floor. And Catherine had real problems once inside public toilets with releasing the door bolt to get out. I soon accompanied her into disabled facilities where I overcome this once we realised that it was the embarrassment. When flying out to Singapore to meet our family, we had to cross from one terminal to another in Dubai and pass through an enormous lounge, which typically in the Middle East has a highly polished marble floor. And Catherine suddenly became absolutely terrified of walking directly across it, and we ended up walking around the perimeter because she thought this huge space was actually a swimming pool. PCA may also cause an object or image to be seen by the individual when they're actually then looking away elsewhere. And people with PCA may always be able to recognise what's immediately in front of them and often will bump into things. Street furniture, such as bins and benches, raised pavement curbs, upward slopes, and particularly going downhill with handrails can be a real problem. We found that travelling up here to London for clinics, particularly using the underground, was very challenging, as commuters typically have little patience unless a disability is blindingly obvious, which unfortunately PCA isn't. And minding the gap was always a huge challenge because Catherine couldn't simultaneously glance down and look ahead whilst falling. Intricate patterns on walls, floors and materials also compromise one's brain sight. That dawned on me when Catherine asked me to stop wearing my beloved check shirts. And deep shadow or dark areas with no edge reference can be highly disconcerting. And one sense of direction, like left and right, may become harder to follow. Now, Catherine was Irish, and left and right confused her before she got PCA. And when we were navigating in the car, and she'd say turn right, and I said, no, it's left. And she said, you know what I mean? Sensitivity to bright light can become more evident, and reflection from shiny surfaces and mirrors can be a real hazard. So keeping the kitchen worktops highly polished, for me, was generally not a good idea. Well, that was my excuse when I took over the chores. Problems with coordination are another feature of PCA, particularly with dressing. And Catherine found frustrating difficulty with small buttons and zips and locating the sleeves on her jacket, and trying to work out which shoe should go on which foot, and then trying to tie them. So Velcro fastenings and loose clothing became the new wardrobe of PCA. So what else did we adjust in coping with the challenges of PCA on our journey? We had to significantly revise our expectations of achievement. During the course of the day, Catherine often became exhausted, and I was told by a wonderful clinical nurse specialist who was assigned to regularly monitor her that it was because there was so much brain processing going on and it was sapping her energy. I didn't just appreciate that. And giving up work when she became more compromised, Catherine would mostly sit quietly in the lounge. She found watching the television really difficult as her concentration span decreased. So classic FM became her saviour. She would just sit there listening, and often she would have her eyes closed, but her eyelids would be fluttering, so she clearly wasn't asleep or unconscious. Getting Catherine up in the morning became difficult. I guess it is for a lot of people. She would wake quite early, but would not want to get up until much later. And if I managed to help get her toileted, showered, dressed, breakfasted by 12 o'clock, I thought I was doing incredibly well. She also wanted to go to bed quite early, and one of the features after she developed PCA was her need to feel what she called safe. She would go to bed not to sleep, but just to be in an environment where she felt comfortable, not challenged, and cocooned by the duvet. Although she had a good appetite and she ate properly, and I did fantastic meals, Catherine suddenly lost a significant amount of weight. She had to take protein supplement drinks as she was considered at risk from malnutrition, which is a real shock. I then learned about the existence of the MUST guide and the Bristol stool chart, as I required to monitor her health at home. And she also became very susceptible to urinary tract infection and delirium. She became susceptible to falls, not properly toppling forward, but by missing handholds and just sinking to the floor. I removed everything in the house that was likely to cause her trip hazards. Took away the rungs from the kitchen, the extra rug in the lounge, rearranged chairs that she could navigate from chair to chair by aiming for another close by, and so on to the door frame and then into the kitchen. And I changed out the gas hob for an induction one that she couldn't tell when the gas element was lit. And I took over all meal preparation and did fantastic cooking. When she was seated at the table for meals, she would sometimes loll dramatically to her left side. And even though I tried to help her straighten up, she would just argue, I am upright. In other words, get away. So her sense of balance was clearly failing, and her body positioning relative to vertical became completely skewed. And she struggled with cutlery and cutting up food, and eventually she gave up feeding and drinking by herself. Navigating stairs became very challenging. She adopted the process of kicking the riser with her toe to locate it and then systematically moved up step by step. And coming down, frighteningly, she did this backwards while holding onto the rails. And her walking and balance became compromised. So we'd hold on to each other all the time when we were out walking. My sons used to say, God, you're really loving mum now. Early into her condition, we arranged to update her will while she still had the mental capacity to understand what choices she was making and was able to sign the document. Her ability to write legibly deteriorated quite rapidly. We also organised lasting power of attorney, and I highly recommend that anybody who has this diagnosis with a loved one should get these drawn up for both health and finance decisions. It's relatively straightforward to do it online and needs to be registered. But I found possessing this to be vital when it came to influencing decisions about Catherine's ongoing treatment and speaking on her behalf with her permission, especially when she was admitted to hospital a couple of times after falls and her chest infection, because she was unable to answer all the questions that were posed during triage, x-ray, and admission to a recovery ward. I also kept, annually, a detailed file of all the consultant letters and the clinical outcomes over the several years. And I found this invaluable when she was seeing different specialists and moving between different NHS trusts, because her records never seemed to be available as one, and she was always being interrogated for the detail, even upon hospital admission. I was never sure whether this was a deliberate test of her recall and level of cognition, or that the clinician just wanted the facts. So I used to refrain and hold back from immediately speaking on her behalf and jumping in with the info, because I knew it was an obvious answer. But often there was a pregnant pause while the consultant looked quizzically at both of us, anticipating a response with her history. It's a very fine judgment, I discovered, to avoid embarrassment or be overriding one's partner. But then if Catherine looked at me helplessly, I'd just give the answers on her behalf. For me, I had to soon learn into Catherine's illness that I had to be extra patient. I learned to coax, encourage, and gently influence Catherine to do necessary things, rather than trying to instruct, persuade, or argue with her. As being Irish, she certainly did not like being told what to do, and she soon told me. Getting ready to go out to places meant allowing much more time to prepare and get out of the door into the car, and similarly, we needed much more time to arrive and disembark. To try and make life tolerable, we tried to go out at least 2 or 3 times a week, while we could, and she loved having coffee in the peaceful surroundings of our local cathedral, and enjoyed a nearby nature reserve. She also finds singing for the brain to be a real tonic, even though missing out some words and not following the accompanying actions didn't seem to bother her, and certainly not the others. I found it useful to put low-level lighting under the bed so Catherine, if she got up at the toilet in the night, could more easily see where the floor was, but without needing the very bright light overhead in her sleepy state. I had pressure mats and sensors to alert me when she got out of the bed or chairs and was on the move. These allowed me to get on with other things in the house rather than being in the same room, overseeing her all the time. When eventually admitted to a nursing home, Catherine required a wheelchair and a lift to move her back between the floors, and she actually hated being hoisted when she was tired. Sometimes it was a real palaver, and she felt very unsafe being swung about in the air as she lost all reference. I encouraged the nursing assistants to approach her at eye level beforehand and gently explain what they're about to do, and that mostly seemed to reassure her. So what else did I learn from all of this? Perhaps the same with the diagnosis of PCA, just try and be kind to each other. You must be prepared to be patient, to adjust your expectations, and to revise long-term plans. But I do encourage you to make the most of your time together. This is not necessarily typical. My discovery was that days with PCA are never likely to be all the same, and nor will a life with PCA remain predictable. And yours may not be the same as our experience. There are now many services commissioned by local authorities to provide social support to caregivers in the community. And I do encourage you to register with your local organisation for carer support. I found the practical help they offer can be invaluable. And lastly, but most importantly, the dedicated team at Register and Support Group have become extremely knowledgeable about PCA over recent years, working in conjunction with the Dementia Research Centre at UCL, which is the hub for patient-centred research into young onset and the rare dementias. I must remind you that our journey began 14 years ago, and the knowledge of PCA is much greater now. And I hope I won't be castigated by Nikki for saying this, but if you're floundering, want some help, and feel you need the support, then I do recommend you contact the RDS team to benefit from the wider experience. As I say, I started this journey 14 years ago, and some of the lovely young ladies in the room were probably still at school. I told you. So if you're floundering and want some support, then do contact the team. They've got experience, they can give you special advice, or just give you their informed guidance to help you one-to-one with this condition and its effects. I did, and I still do, and I find it immensely comforting. Living with PCA will never be what you expected, but you can still do a lot together. Looking ahead is undoubtedly going to be a challenging journey for you, and there's no denying there will be downsides. But there may also be some remarkable upsides, as I discovered. Catherine and I found you can be content and have a giggle. We did hug a lot, and we became much more tactile. We found new ways to interact and share our thoughts, and we enjoyed fresh air and spaces. Hopefully, in a similar way, you and your family will find enjoyment on your unexpected journey with PCA. So I finish by wishing you all the best, and I trust that some of my insight might help you.
You suggested before you spoke that maybe giving too big a build-up. I think the reverse is true. You are incredibly kind to come and share not just information, but also experience, but also to do it with such warmth and gentleness and fantastic consideration for other people who may be at different stages on their journey. So, sincere thanks. Thank you. I'm sure lots of people will have questions for you, but if it's okay, we've got a couple more talks, so we thought we'd save up questions for the end. And also, I've got a couple of announcements at the beginning. Could you possibly maybe just put back to their pieces?
Oh, yes.
If that's all right. There's a wonderful array of people, some of whom are stood at the back, generously giving seats to others, who would love to talk to you today. I'm obviously a bit biased, but I can say with all sincerity that these are, to a person, fantastic, dedicated, and compassionate people who would love to talk to you. They've all got different backgrounds, experiences, both personal and professional, and they're only too willing to talk to you today and to make friends with you as we try and grow this RDS community. So I really encourage you both to talk to them, but also to feel free to ask them for their support. Everyone's contributed, but I particularly wanted to single out Seamus, Cece, and of course Nikki for arranging this meeting today. They've done a huge amount of work behind the scenes to get us all together, and it's deeply, deeply appreciated. The other, I'll put out a quick round of applause. The other thing was just a reminder, I should have said, please don't feel constrained. This is meant to be a kind of like more like a family gathering than a kind of formal lecture. So if you want to get up in between the talks, if you need the loo, if you want to go and grab some more tea or coffee or water during the talks or in between them, please feel free, don't feel embarrassed. So now it's my pleasure to introduce a dear friend and colleague, Kia Yong. Keir has been invested heavily in trying to push forward on our understanding of PCA. And again, it's no overstatement to say he's really at the forefront of pushing forward international PCA research efforts. And so he's going to talk to you, and he also co-leads the PCA research program at UCL. So I'll let Keir introduce his talk and himself in more detail. He's going to be telling you about international research collaboration.
Thank you, Seb. And thank you, Robert, for a characteristically engaging, sensitive and informative overview of PCA. And I challenge most academic researchers to really do better. So as Seb mentioned, my name is Keir. We lead the UCL PCA study. And I can't emphasize how great it is to be meeting new and long-standing members here in person today. I met some of the people in attendance at the London and regional PCA support group meetings over the last 12 or so years, or through their involvement in research. And whether it's your first or fifth time here, please feel free to say hi over lunch. And while the last 2 years have presented a number of challenges for conducting research, there have been some areas of quite high research activity, particularly in the sort of international sphere. Now, one example is international working to advance understanding, support and treatment regarding PCA. I'll be giving 3 updates. Firstly, regarding a project led by University of California, San Francisco to pool existing information on PCA symptoms, imaging findings, and causes. This information has been provided by hundreds of PCA participants across over 15 countries worldwide. Secondly, I'll give an overview of a session at the largest international conference worldwide dedicated to dementia research. And this session is focusing on how Alzheimer's disease may affect different people, often in quite different ways. Thirdly, I'll give a brief update on resuming in-person research with support from international collaborators. These projects have been supported by members of Alzheimer's Association's professional interest groups. These groups focus on PCA and people in whom Alzheimer's disease may result in changes in vision, spatial awareness, language and movement, more so than memory. Now, the membership of these professional groups comprises about 600 researchers and clinicians across 40 countries. My involvement in these is as their PCA research chair, and I've been elected to their executive committee in part to steer the research agenda regarding PCA and related neurodegenerative conditions. And I'm going to start by playing a conversation with University of California, San Francisco researcher, Marianne Chaplow.
Hi there, my name's Keir. Some of you may know me from research. I lead the UCL PCA study with Sebastian Crotch. I'm very pleased to be joined here today by Marianne.
Hi everyone, my name is Marianne. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist. I received my license in Canada, and then I moved to the US to start a postdoctoral fellowship in neurology at the Memory and Aging Center in San Francisco.
So Marianne, could you tell me a bit about the project that you're working on? You're based in University of California, San Francisco.
Yeah, of course. So we are conducting right now a international multi-site project on posterior cortical atrophy. So basically, we're pooling clinical, neuroimaging, and pathological data of PCA patients across the whole world. So we have patients in North America, we have patients across Europe, in Asia. So really, it's a multi-site international effort.
And how many people so far have volunteered information for this study?
Yeah, so for now we have, I think, 800 patients collected, and our goal is to, or at least we think that we'll get about 1,500 patients, individual data from 1,500 patients.
So multi-center criteria define PCA. both as a syndrome, so essentially this combination of symptoms and to an extent imaging findings, as well as the underlying disease which causes PCA. So would you say it's helpful to know both?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think that it's really helpful to know what the syndrome is. So a syndrome basically is a set of symptoms that when you pull them together, it creates the syndrome in particular. So for instance, patients that have predominant visual spatial impairments will receive a diagnosis of posterior cortical atrophy because the set of symptoms are a part of this specific syndrome. On the other hand, it's also important and helpful to know what disease is causing the symptoms. So in PCA, we know that it's often Alzheimer's disease, who's the underlying pathology causing the symptoms. And it's helpful to know because, we're in an era where various medications are being tested and will be offered to patients or are already offered to patients. And so knowing if it's Alzheimer's or not will guide what interventions and medications will be offered to patients. And so it really is helpful to know both what the symptoms the patient is experiencing, because then we can provide specific interventions on a daily basis to try to make the symptoms more manageable, and on the other hand, knowing the disease to better guide the medication or medical interventions that will be proposed.
Well, thank you. So it's great seeing this work alongside previous multi-center efforts. So with these examples, including the development of international criteria for PCA, or international studies understanding risks for PCA or PCA progression. So these previous efforts have involved University of California, San Francisco, where you call it from, work with centers like University of College London and other centers, particularly ones which have taken place over the past 10 years. But what do you see as the next step for multi-center work to advance understanding of PCA?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that the next step is to better understand what disease is causing PCA, because for now we know, as I mentioned earlier, that Alzheimer's disease in about 95% of the cases is the cause of PCA, but we don't know for sure because the samples that the studies were based on were fairly small. And so that's something that I think in the next years or even decade will be interesting to take a look at, is what is the underlying diseases that can create a syndrome such as PCA. And is it just one disease? Can it be multiple diseases that combined together will create this specific syndromic presentation? And so this is something that I think will be helpful to know, to guide the medication again. Because if it's not Alzheimer's disease, you don't want to prescribe an Alzheimer's disease related medication because it's not going to improve the symptoms. So this is going to be helpful to know.
Thank you. So while I appreciate that data collection is still ongoing and you're in the process of analyzing data, do you have a sense so far that PCA is very consistent across these different centers? So it's over, as I understand it, 800 people whose information you already have, or does it seem to be quite variable?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in terms of disease, I can already tell you based on, I think we have about 800 patients to this day, that Alzheimer's disease seems to be the main disease underlying the symptoms. So that's pretty consistent across countries, across different sites. But in terms of symptoms, there's a lot of heterogeneity.
Yeah.
And I think that's the beauty of conducting an international project, is that we'll be able to better get a sense of what's the proportion of the symptoms being expressed by patients, or if it's very heterogeneous. And for now, I think we can conclude that it seems to be pretty heterogeneous. So some patients will have specific symptoms while others won't. So this is something we'll get a better sense with this project.
Thank you for sharing, because I think it speaks to the experience of both people within the meeting today, but also for research participants, even just at UCL. Again, there seems to be quite a bit of variation from one person to the next, but it's interesting to know that that's noted also between different centres internationally.
So I'm just reflecting on how unsettling it is having two of me on stage at the same time. I hope you're not sick of me. So to continue along this topic of variation or heterogeneity, as Marianne put it, the second update on international collaboration relates to a conference session focused on how Alzheimer's disease may affect different people, often quite differently. And this has been recently accepted at the largest international conference on Alzheimer's and dementia research worldwide. So a particular focus of this session is to understand whether and how changes on cognitive assessments and scans over time are influenced by the age at which people develop symptoms, the type of symptoms people are experiencing, for example, predominantly memory, visual, language, as well as risk factors associated with Alzheimer's disease. You can think of these sessions as a sort of supergroup of researchers put together by an organizer, in this case myself, whose areas align, but each of whom has a particular area of expertise. This involves world-leading centers from the United States, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, with expertise in imaging, computer science, analysis of proteins associated with Alzheimer's disease, and inflammation. All the researchers involved have contributed to our understanding of how Alzheimer's disease pathology may cause visuospatial, language, movement, and planning more so than memory symptoms, how this may relate to the age at which one experiences symptoms, and how areas of the brain which tend to be most susceptible to Alzheimer's disease appear to be relatively resilient in a number of people, despite the vulnerability of other areas, including those towards the back of the brain. Finally, an update on resuming in-person research. We've been very privileged that a number of participants with a diagnosis of PCA have volunteered for the study, developing strategies to support reaching and coordination since we resumed in-person visits in February. This study is funded by the Alzheimer's Society and Etherington PCA program and involves collaboration between University College London and world experts in hand-eye coordination from the University of Edinburgh and University of Lyon to better understand and support people who are experiencing difficulties, say, with reaching to objects, for example, this glass on a busy tabletop, or for other people, difficulties with aspects of dressing, such as with finding, say, the right sleeve of a jacket. Please feel free to have a chat if you might be interested in discussing these or other PCA-related research. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions in the panel Q&A.
Fantastic, thank you, Keir. For those of you who haven't had the pleasure of getting to know Keir yet, he is painfully humble. And when he talks about how about these international efforts, he's pushing and pulling the strings for a lot of these things. And when he talks about international conferences and all these glamorous researchers, that's because he's motivated by keeping the condition that's affecting your lives in the headlights, in the spotlight, for research attention, for research funding, and for having the brightest minds think about what can we do about it. And also, a lot of this work is also triggered and influenced so much by what we hear from you at these sorts of meetings. So, for example, the initial diagnostic criteria, the sort of internationally recognised diagnostic criteria for just describing what PCA is, was triggered because someone at one of these meetings a good number of years ago stood up in frustration at one of the talks we'd given and said, "Don't you guys talk to each other? What do you mean? What do you mean people are defining PCA differently in different places? You should have a collective agreement." So that's what we went and did. And so it's not just that we do listen to you at these meetings, it's that we want to listen to you. So please, whether your feedback is positive or negative or just curious, please talk to us, because you never know what kind of light bulb it will flash on in someone's head or at one of these meetings to push understanding further or faster. So thank you, Keir. Delighted now to say for our final talk this morning to welcome Alicia Willoughby. Cece is a PhD student on our Etherington PCA research programme, and again, she can introduce herself much better than I can, but it's fantastic. But I think this is your first presentation of one of these meetings. Even though you've been several times before. We're really, really delighted that you're here with us today, so I shall hand it to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. For those who don't know me, my name is Alicia Willoughby, as Seb said. I'm part of RDS's wonderful direct support team, and I'm also a PhD student at the Dementia Research Centre as part of the Etherington PCA project. You may remember that last year, Chris Hardy and I gave a presentation about the staging work at the early to mid-stage carers meeting. And today I'm here to update you on the progress of the PCA staging project. Before we continue, I just want to note that throughout this presentation, there will be lots of graphs and information to take in, but please don't worry about trying to read everything on the slides or make notes, because I will explain everything that's presented to you, and the slides will be sent to you after the seminar as well. So why are we doing this research? We are conducting research into the staging of PCA because we know that when people are diagnosed, they often have lots of questions like, what will happen next? Can I continue to work? And how can I plan for my future? These are all very valid questions. These are all very valid questions that we don't have definitive answers for, but we hope that through this research, we can provide those who are newly diagnosed and their care partners with a useful tool to make some of those answers a little bit clearer and help you feel better prepared. So some of you may be familiar with this document on the screen just now. It's the first version of the stages of PCA, and we're very fortunate to have this excellent foundation to build upon as we create the new version of the staging document. The original document attempts to provide a general framework for describing how abilities may change during the course of PCA, and we know from your feedback just how helpful it is. We know from members' feedback that the staging document is helpful for understanding the changes to come, understanding whether certain changes are attributable to PCA, and planning for future care needs. It's also allowed members to connect more easily with one another by gauging which stage others are at during support group meetings. We also know that members find it useful to share this document with their healthcare professionals who may not be familiar with PCA, so that they can improve their understanding and provide you with better, more appropriate support. Having a basic idea of staging improves the communication between you and your healthcare professionals, because there's already a shared understanding of which changes might be happening and what might be to come. It is evident that there is a need for this document, and therefore we wanted to develop it further so as it was in line with our ever-growing understanding of PCA. So how did we collect the data for the project? Well, to get started, we went through the original document with the help of some of our lovely PCA support group members. We thought about what was missing, and from there we created a questionnaire that was refined many times to ensure that we would be collecting all of the necessary data. Then we invited RDS members and members from the PCA Awareness Facebook group to complete the questionnaire. The questionnaire, which you can see a copy of on the screen just now, took symptoms laid out in the first staging document and asked, is this in the correct stage? Where participants could then indicate no, yes, no it was earlier, or no it was later. We then asked how prominent was this symptom, and some additional questions about strategies people found useful, health or social care professionals people had had useful interactions with, and for any other comments that they might wish to make. Within the questionnaire, we also asked about some additional features that weren't well covered in the first document, such as behaviour, language, and sensory changes. We tried to make the questionnaire as accessible as possible, but we also offered phone calls to gather responses for those living with PCA. We shared the survey in 2 waves and had great responses each time. In the first wave of data collection, we had 94 respondents, and in the second, we had 130. So overall, we've received data from 224 people for this study. However, the presentation today is just going to focus on the data that we collected in wave 1. We invited people living with a diagnosis, carers, and bereaved carers to take part in this study. And as you can see here, the majority of responses came from carers. We received data from participants in the UK, USA, Norway, Spain, and Canada, and we also collected information on people's living situations. The majority of participants were living at home, and when we broke down the responses of those who selected other as their living situation, we can see that 87% were in care homes, 6% were living in retirement communities, and 7% were in specialist neurological facilities. This information is very important in helping us as researchers identify where and how we share the findings of our work. One of the first changes that we made from the original document was to recategorize the stages. The previous document listed stages 1 to 7, with stage 1 listed as no impairment. However, we thought that this was unhelpful and so changed the stages from 1 to 6, with stage 1 now encompassing the symptoms that were previously listed under stage 2. You can see here on the screen the symptoms that were listed in the survey under stage 1. So just to reiterate before we move on, we asked participants to indicate whether they thought each symptom was in the right stage based on their experience, or if it should be categorized earlier or later. So this is a graph that shows the responses about the stage 1 symptoms. Each bar represents a response of participants. So responses of the symptom should be listed earlier are represented by these light green bars. Responses to indicate that the symptom was in the correct stage are represented by the blue bars. Responses of symptoms should be listed later are represented by the yellow bars, which leaves the dark green bars representing responses of not applicable. We can see here that the majority of participants indicated a loss of confidence in driving ability and problems using a computer were in the correct stage, whereas symptoms of difficulty finding the right word when speaking stand out because of a higher response rate for this occurring in a later stage. We also asked participants to rate the prominence of each symptom at this stage, and as is evident in this graph, some of the symptoms have more of an effect on day-to-day life than others. We can see here that the 2 symptoms which were voted as being in the correct stage are also rated as more prominent because a greater percentage of participants categorized them as very prominent, as shown by the orange bars, and quite prominent, as shown by the yellow bars. Having the data on how prominent a symptom really is helps us as researchers understand which symptoms to think about in developing interventions. It was also useful for us to collect information on whether there was anything that participants felt should be included at this stage that wasn't already. And this has helped us think about some much broader symptoms that we could consider adding to stage 1. From all of the responses, we were able to identify repeated items and categorize them. And the items that came up most frequently are shown here. So a difficulty with daily activity, a lack of or a change in confidence, increasing difficulty in following instructions, and a denial of symptoms or a reluctance to accept help. They are broader than the symptoms originally listed in stage 1, but it's important that we consider these in the updated document because although they may not be exclusive to PCA, they do provide a good sense of some of the initial challenges that people may face. We didn't want the updated document to simply outline symptoms, and for that reason, we also asked people if they had any useful strategies for managing the symptoms in this stage. People gave us a range of responses, and the most common are listed here. So we had for stage 1, an increase in personal support, making sure that you're involving family and friends at those earlier stages, gently assisting the person living with PCA, so offering to help with tasks rather than just stepping in and taking over, using audiobooks in place of books and reading, and developing a routine that you can stick to. Participants also listed seeking out support for the carer as a useful tool at this stage, as many carers will often postpone engaging in support for themselves until a situation is becoming unmanageable. Lastly, lots of responses indicated that it's very hard to implement strategies at this stage, even if they are available, because the person living with the diagnosis may not be willing or ready to accept them. So moving on to stage 2 now, listed here are some of the symptoms in this stage. So these include items such as difficulty seeing things which are right under your nose, problems with writing, spelling, and dealing with numbers, and mild memory problems for recent events. Now, similarly to the graph presented for stage 1, this graph demonstrates how participants responded to whether or not the stage 2 symptoms were in the right stage. We can see that for most of the symptoms, people felt that they were in the right stage. So that's all those blue bars on the graph there. For the symptom difficulties dressing and performing other activities that require spatial judgment, we can see nearly an equal number of participants selected it as being in the right stage and needing to be listed later. This highlights the complexity of PCA and how symptom progression varies from person to person. Going forward with the staging project, we will be delving into symptoms like this further to identify where they are best placed. This graph shows how the participants rated each symptom in stage 2 in terms of its prominence. So compared to the stage 1 symptoms, it's clear that the symptoms here have a higher impact on daily life and abilities. I have inserted the stage 1 bars just at the side there for comparison. In stage 1, the compound percentages for the category very and quite don't go above 40%, whereas in stage 2, the compound percentages for the same categories are almost always above 40%, which is marked with the purple line just there. This data appears to reiterate what we already know, that symptoms become more present and potentially more challenging as PCA progresses. In answer to the question, is there anything else that should be included at this stage? These were the most frequent responses. So we had a change in mood or the onset of depression or anxiety, familiar environments becoming harder to navigate, increased confusion, and sensory changes. So for example, an increased sensitivity to things being hot or cold. It was interesting to see the comments on behavioural and sensory changes, as these were things we wanted to include in the updated document from the outset. So the useful strategies that participants offered for stage 2 are as follows. Increased care at home. So this includes having things like a part-time personal assistant rather than a live-in carer. Making changes to the home environment. So examples of this include rearranging rooms so as furniture is out of the way, always keeping certain items in allocated places, or changing lighting setups. Implementing adaptive technology. So this means using devices like an Amazon Alexa or perhaps GPS tags for walks. Maintaining social activities. So finding activity groups, and as we often advise on the support team, they don't have to be dementia specific either. With the right support and education, regular groups can be appropriate for people living with PCA too. There were also comments given in the useful strategies section about the importance of carers accessing help and staying in touch with their friends and family. We are sure that there will be many more useful strategies that come to light as we get further into this project. So as I mentioned earlier, we also wanted to include some other symptoms in the updated document that people living with PCA might experience. These include language, sensory changes, and behaviour or mood changes. It was important to us that these were included because comments have been raised at support group meetings and in direct support calls that suggest a number of people are experiencing these symptoms throughout the progression of PCA. The original staging document does mention a few symptoms that are linked to speech and language. However, we wanted to make sure that the language symptoms were comprehensively covered. The symptoms we asked about, which are listed on the screen, are symptoms of another form of rare dementia called primary progressive aphasia, or PPA. PPA is a form of dementia that is characterized by predominant language symptoms, and we wanted to see if there were commonalities in the symptoms across the two types of rare dementia. We asked participants to indicate whether each symptom was present or absent at any point during the progression of PCA. The orange bars represent a response of absent, and the yellow bars represent a response of present. We can see here that for 4 of the symptoms, over 60% of participants indicated that the symptom was present. In addition to asking if it was or wasn't present, we also asked participants to indicate when the symptom first arose and whether it was present in the early, mid, and or late stages. The orange bars represent the early stages, the yellow bars indicate middle stages, and the green bars are the late stages. So to explore an example from this graph with you, more participants first experienced the symptom of difficulty hearing in a busy environment in the earlier stages. We are aware that people living with PCA can find it challenging to isolate one voice or sound in an environment with lots of chatter and background noise. So having an idea of when this starts to affect people will be really helpful for knowing when to potentially offer more support to someone in a social setting. Continuing on to sensory changes now, we asked participants to indicate in which stage they first noticed or experienced sensory changes. The participants who completed these questions indicated that there was an equal split between sensory changes first appearing in the early stages and the middle stages. Data was also collected on the prominence of these changes, and participants indicated that sensory symptoms were largely mild or moderate in their effect on daily life. As well as knowing when sensory changes happen and how mild or severe these changes can be, we also wanted to understand exactly what these changes were. Therefore, we asked participants to select all symptoms that they had experience of from a given list. The most commonly reported symptoms were cold hands and feet and sensitivity to sound. Sensitivity to changes in temperature was also frequently reported, and we know from our members' accounts that sometimes people living with PCA will want to have lots of blankets and jackets and layers on them, even in really warm weather. For the items participants listed in the category of other, we had the following responses. So a hypersensitivity to pain, an improved sense of smell, hypersensitivity to labels and clothing, dislike of the sensation of showering. So these are symptoms that we would need to investigate further, but this project has been useful for bringing to light information that we otherwise may not have known about. Changes in behaviour and mood for those living with PCA is something that I've heard mentioned a lot at the PCA carers support group meetings. And it's particularly challenging because it's a particularly challenging aspect of dementia. So when collecting data for this series of items, we only took the responses from carers and bereaved carers. We didn't ask people living with a diagnosis because it can be very hard to accurately reflect on your own behaviour. We offered participants a list of behaviours, including items like anxiety, hallucinations, and agitation, and we then asked them to indicate whether the symptom was present in the early, middle, and/or late stages. The orange bars indicate a symptom was absent, and the blue indicates that it was present. So we can see that for the early stages, only the symptoms of depression and anxiety were reported as present. Moving then to the middle stages, we see an increase in the number of behavioural symptoms that are being reported as present. And again, in the later stages, this increases. We see an increase in the reporting of motor disturbances, and although elation and euphoria are still mostly absent in the later stages, we do see a greater number of participants indicating that it's more present than it had been previously. Prominence of behavioural changes was also recorded for each stage. So in the early stages, it is evident that although there may be some behavioural changes, overall they are mild and moderate, as represented by the green and blue bars respectively. Irritability and appetite are the only items that have been reported as severe in the early stage, but even so, less than 5% of participants gave these responses, so more research and information would be needed. In the middle stages, we start to see more yellow on the graph, which represents severe change. We also see depression and anxiety become more moderate in their impact. We would expect to see this because other symptoms are typically becoming more challenging towards the mid stages, although the insight into the loss of skills is still retained. In the later stages, we see even more yellow on the graph, suggesting that the behavioural symptoms overall become more severe as PCA progresses. At this stage, we also see nighttime behaviours shift from mild to moderate. The staging project is a large-scale project and will therefore take time to complete. Today, I have shared with you the reasons that we are conducting this research, how we collected the data for the project, data from stages 1 and 2, and additional comments and strategies shared by our participants, and an insight into the mapping of language symptoms and sensory and behavioural changes. We aim to continue sharing these updates with you as the project progresses, and I hope that you were all able to take something informative away from this presentation. If you would like to talk more about the PCA staging project, please don't hesitate to come and say hello. So I've linked the original stages of PCA document here for those that would like to take a look after today's seminar. And I've also linked a previous video from my lovely colleagues Claire and Livy, where they talk through assistive technology and adaptations. Lastly, just to say thank you to everybody who has helped with this project so far. Your contributions are very valuable. Thank you all for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you, Susan, so much for that really informative talk. And just a reminder that all that information, which is quite detailed, will be available afterwards. Just while Nikki, Keir, Robert and Paul come up, maybe come and stand at the front for a few questions and answers now, because that's the end of our formal talks. Now we move into the less formal part of the meeting. So it's question and answers, some lunch and some chat round tables this afternoon. I just wanted to reiterate Cece's thank you that it's extraordinary to me, given that the first PCA support group meeting, there were about 10 of us there. So to start having, being able to do pieces of work like this, where there are more than 200 respondents, is an amazing reflection of people's generosity and giving them their time. So huge thank you. Right, so Robert, so I do come out. We've got a couple of microphones, one up here at the front and one sort of roving around back.
We don't, we just have this. We're going to shout. And you can have the microphone.
Or run back.
Libby's running.
I've got my trainers on already.
Libby's yelling.
The most important thing is that you hear what you want to say. So just to say, these question and answer sessions, you can please feel very welcome to ask questions about the talks that you've heard, but also everything is fair game. We can't probably solve geopolitical issues and solve the environmental crisis, but if you've got any question about PCA or anything that's relevant, it doesn't have to be specifically related to one of the talks. So would anybody care to be brave? Thank you.
Hello, yes, I'm Sam, and this is my mum who was diagnosed with PCA in June last year. And we both got a question, which is she's also been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and we wanted to know that obviously listening to the research, there is some link, we think, between it, but what effect is there a known effect that they have on each other? Does Alzheimer's make PCA worse, or does PCA make Alzheimer's worse? Do they affect each other is what we want to know.
I'm going to come to Keir first with that, if I may, but I think it's worth us waiting for the microphone just so people listening can hear. So, Keir, you want to respond?
Thank you for your question. So I think the short answer is, again, it's not straightforward, it's complicated. And you may have picked up that both Robert had used the term syndrome, and also the researcher who was calling in from the States referred to both syndrome and disease. And this is something which, again, is not necessarily that intuitive, and I think it's fair to say it may have even held back the field for a while. In times like, say, the 90s, people would talk about visual variant Alzheimer's disease. So I think this is a reflection of how, at that point, there were a number of people who had the proteins associated with Alzheimer's disease, but the symptoms that they were experiencing weren't characteristically to do with memory. Some of the things they report early difficulty with was things like climbing stairs, sometimes difficulty reading analog clocks, but actually things like short-term memory could be quite spared even for years after initially noticing visual symptoms. The tricky thing is there's other people who have symptoms which are like what I mentioned, but they don't have the proteins that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. These tend to be in a minority of people who have PCA, but there's other neurodegenerative diseases such as Lewy body pathology, for instance, which can be associated sometimes with other clinical symptoms. So things like sleep disturbances, some movement symptoms, and in some cases, visual hallucinations. And in some very rare cases, there can be other causes of PCA that are either one of these two diseases. But in short, you have the syndrome, which is really this combination of different symptoms, and to an extent, findings that might be observed, say, on an MRI scan or an FDG PET scan, so things to do essentially with the shape, the structure, the activity of areas toward the back of the brain. But then you actually have the proteins associated with those symptoms and those changes that are evident on the scan. So in short, we can think of syndrome as almost sort of being at the top level in terms of those symptoms and any imaging findings. And in the disease, which in the most case of PCA is Alzheimer's disease pathology, that's really causing the syndrome.
Yeah.
Thank you, great question. Another follow-up.
Where am I going?
Yeah.
There we go.
Just a question from that. So the proteins are found through the lumbar puncture, yeah? Is that right? That's how you do that. So if you haven't had lumbar puncture, you wouldn't know that answer. Yeah, correct. That's just my understanding. Oh, my Lynn had many brain scans, but never a lumbar puncture, that's all. Not that it matters, it's just from my understanding and maybe because I don't know.
So I'm just only responding because I don't know if on the call they can hear.
Yeah, we'll just wait for my phone.
So lumbar puncture is one way to get an idea of the proteins, again, associated with PCA, as in whether there might be Alzheimer's disease. Those are really the most routinely available analysis of what we call cerebrospinal fluid. However, there are what we call molecular imaging techniques. So these aren't routine scans that most people would have had, but they can actually visualize, again, these hallmark proteins which are associated with Alzheimer's disease in people. So you would have a radioactive tracer which would pick up, for example, amyloid, or the other one associated with Alzheimer's disease is tau. And you can look again at the distribution of these proteins across the brain. And actually, particularly for tau, and this is an area of research for a number of people with PCA. And again, just to emphasize here, these techniques have only been routinely available and they're still not that readily available in the last 5 to 10 years, which is relatively recent in research terms. So in about the last 5 years, increasingly, there's been evidence that for people with PCA, especially tau, seems to be located more towards the back of the brain and actually not in the areas that are most vulnerable for most people with Alzheimer's disease, which are essentially these medial temporal areas. People might think of them as the sort of memory parts of the brain. And this is a key focus of research, is understanding, well, how come for this particular protein, it doesn't seem to be distributed in the same way as it is for the majority of people who have Alzheimer's disease.
If I could just ask at one point, which is that people get different diagnosed at different times in different centres. Some people get the whole work, some people don't get access to all these investigations. Just to reassure you that if you haven't had the full works, that doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to miss out on anything. So much of the reason we talk about this difference between syndrome and disease is many of the treatments, the advice, the support, the information we can provide is relevant to people who've got that set of experiences, challenges in everyday life, whether you know what it is or not. So just wanted to sort of offer that encouragement. Who has the next question? Sorry, Krista.
Oh, okay. Hello. I was just wondering, because I've seen on various groups that I've seen online, people mention genetic testing. I believe it's to sort of find out sort of how severe things are. Oh, I'm just trying to think of the words now. But I was wondering, is it like an important sort of avenue to look at? Because that wasn't offered to me. I don't know if it's something that I should ask.
Sure.
So to mention, first of all, I'm not a clinician, I only work in research capacity. So I think that the critical thing to emphasize here is that from a research perspective, there's no evidence that the PCA syndrome itself runs in families. There's always a very tricky conversation to have here because some people will say, oh, in my family, I have 5 people who have Alzheimer's disease. And then you ask them, well, how old were they when they developed Alzheimer's disease? They say, oh, in their 80s. But actually, because the greatest risk factor for Alzheimer's disease is age, it's more that people have a lot of long-lived people in their family. So it's not necessarily to say that Alzheimer's runs the family. They have a lot of relatives who live to an old age. In terms of genetic testing for PCA specifically, again, I'm passing on second-hand understanding. I might be corrected here by Seb and Nikki. But I think in some cases it might be investigated if someone develops PCA at a young age and they have a very strong family history of people also developing, say, Alzheimer's disease at a young age. But there's again some very rare cases where there can be some genetic mutations which are associated with having PCA-like symptoms. But just to be clear, in the research literature, I can think of no more than 3 of those that I'm aware of. There's another question about genetics and PCA, but...
Well, did you have a comment?
Well, only just from my experience. Catherine was one of 11 children, and we worked out later on trying to trace back that one of her brothers died from Alzheimer's. He was in Ireland. And we also worked out that her mother, bless her, was pregnant for 22 years. But we were offered the opportunity to have genetic testing for 2 reasons. One was because Catherine and I were concerned whether there was familial Alzheimer's and PCA within her generation. And also to confirm whether she actually had PCA, because she couldn't have the brain scan, and she went through all the other tests that Kira just mentioned, so SPECT and PET and the radiology. One of the key questions that we had to ask in our own minds was, do we want to go through genetic testing? Catherine agreed to, for the purposes of the research program that was being conducted by RDS, and that was completely anonymous. It went off to Switzerland. We were told the answer that it wouldn't be attributed to her as an individual. But the interesting thing was that my eldest son, who is a very anal lawyer, said, how is it going to affect us, Dad? And we had to go through the dilemma of if we had, which we didn't, have a positive result that it was going to be familial, would we tell them? Would it affect their insurance, etc., etc.? So it's a really critical decision that one has to take as to whether you want to enter into genetic testing and whether you want to get a result.
Thank you for that very thoughtful response. Anybody, another question?
Yeah, I got it, thank you. Mum was diagnosed with PCA about 4 years ago, and she's now in a nursing home in Suffolk. She's got Alzheimer's, PCA, and she's got Lewy bodies as well. Does Lewy body presence make things a lot more difficult, or that's just my question?
I'll answer first, and I'll send over to Keir to add some research on this. We often see this, we see the mix, we see the PCA with Alzheimer's disease, that's been what we heard earlier, 95%, but we do see Lewy bodies as well with PCA. So you're going to see a lot of different sort of symptoms, a lot more physical symptoms with Lewy bodies because it's very much associated with Parkinson's, people refer it to as the cruel cousin of Parkinson's disease. So you'll see tremors, you'll see mobility problems, you'll see stiffness, but you'll also quite often see hallucinations and Capgras syndrome, which when people almost sort of call it imposter syndrome as well. So lots of different symptoms which we'll see with the crossover with that. I think with all dementias, no matter whatever the rare dementia is, there are always going to be various different symptoms that come into play, which will affect people's mobility, they affect their personalities and behaviour, and then affect sort of speech and language and communication as well. So it is always very individual. I always think of people's brains being their own computers. So different parts of the computer programs don't work at certain stages. So it will affect people differently, but those are the sorts of things that I would imagine to be aware of. Keir, do you want to? Oh, Keir's what's everybody.
And I think it just goes into that old, maybe sounds like a cliche, but not asking always what disease the person has, but what person the disease has. So just thinking about the individual and how their symptoms and experiences might need support in different ways. So yes, again, if you have one of these slightly more complicated or mixed diagnoses, again, it doesn't mean that the usual things that are applicable or helpful for people with typical PCA won't be helpful, but it might need a bit of adaptation.
Thank you. Hello, my name's Mark. My wife Tracy got diagnosed just under 3 years ago. As I recall, there was a suggestion that in the earlier stages of PCA, if you did certain things, physical activity and mental stimulation, that can hedge against it, for want of a better way of describing it. However, I was talking to a nurse recently and who specialises in Alzheimer's and associated illnesses, and she was fairly sure that there's no evidence for it. So has anyone got any kind of thoughts on that, please?
Or we could maybe talk a bit about sort of cultural activities as well.
So I have to emphasize again, I'm not a clinician. I can say what's out there in the research literature, and I think it's fair to say there was a Cochrane review out recently, which again, this isn't my area of research, was saying there could be perhaps some very modest benefits of things to do with certain types of activities, I think to do with maintaining sort of functional independence. But again, it's probably fair to say that there's more research required in this area. So speaking, I think, more anecdotally and based off really the experiences the participants have shared with me, I think clearly there can be benefits people appreciate of, again, going on, say, a walk, some social activities where people feel comfortable around, safe and accepted by. And I think the challenge can be for some things like, say, some cognitive training, is that while some people feel, okay, well, maybe I'm getting something from this, I think there can be trade-offs. And again, speaking more anecdotally, people work with, where if someone's feeling that they're really pushing themselves to have to do it and it's causing them any stress or agitation, any potential benefits are going to be outweighed by how much essentially sort of grief that person is causing themselves. So I think we just have to bear in mind, there might be some benefits, also there can be risks of some approaches. And I think Paul had a point more on the sort of social side.
Social, but just to follow that, there was a study done a few years ago on reminiscence therapy, and about really trying to help people to remember, and the equation to that is if you can remember within reminiscence therapy, that can help your dementia in some way. The results were extremely disappointing, in some ways perhaps not surprisingly. The carers, actually their scores in anxiety and depression increased from reminiscence therapy because it reminded them of everything that was lost or missed. The people with dementia, mostly Alzheimer's type, but not exclusively, there was no benefit. Since then, quite a bit of other research has been done around different cultural activities of the social benefits. And some of the work that we've done has been with museums, with singing groups, and we've had several people say to us how beneficial that was to them personally. And we can show that in some statistical analyses, also some qualitative work, but beneficial in a variety of different ways. It gave them a sense of integrity, of identity, of meaning, that they can participate in activities like everyone else around them. They're not a patient when they're doing this, that they're a human being. And so that's some of the work that is continuing now really internationally. I have to say the UK led that, I'm very proud of that, but there's now in many countries that are looking more and more at different types of arts. It's not a panacea, but it's helpful about engagement and stimulation. So I urge you to think about that as you go on your journey.
And if it's okay just to add a couple of things quickly, one being more general and one being more specific to PCA. Paul talked about stimulation. There is an evidence base out there on cognitive stimulation therapy. Now, again, it might be that the benefits are modest, and I think a potential limitation here, speaking to someone who's trained to deliver cognitive stimulation therapy, is that for some people who might have prominent visual difficulties, a lot of the activities are visually mediated. So that is something to bear in mind, and I think it's probably fair to say that people like Seb and Paul are working with psychologists at UCL, I think, to get a more sort of nuanced idea about how to tailor these kind of psychosocial group therapies to better suit people with a range of needs. The last thing I mentioned are strategies which are tailored to symptoms. So as Seb mentioned earlier, the app Read Clear, which has been made possible from people with PCA who volunteered for research over a period of years, who've reported things like letters or words jumbling or cluttering up on a page of text, or people becoming lost in a page of text while reading. And we've applied some of our understanding from research, often what seem to be these quite abstract studies, to develop assistive technology to promote reading as an independent activity. And some of the other work that we've been doing since then is focusing on things like environmental adaptations to help with things like orientation, navigation. And at this point, we do have a study which is trying to focus more on supporting upper limb functions, so things like reaching. But just to reiterate, these are kind of works in progress. The reason why we're doing the research is to try and give us more tools for professionals to support the day-to-day activities.
Sorry, I just want to add about well-being to this, because we were very much looking about sort of cognitive stimulation and measuring how people are in probably part of their journey with the dementia. What is really important and is so underestimated is how people are feeling and what makes them happy. And I have this discussion with my mum all the time that I don't do crosswords. So I'm going to really fail later, because of this. So please, read me poetry, put me some music on, and make me dance, do those sorts of things. Because what's more important to me, and what I hope is going to be more important to you, is somebody's happiness and their well-being. And that can be measured through pleasure and smiling.
Something else that gives people great pleasure and makes them smile is food. I can begin to hear people's tummies rumbling. So we're a little bit past time, but I thought we would allow one or two last quick questions. and then we'll move on through from. So I can see two hands, so we'll go to these two gentlemen and then we'll
I have PCA. I'm there. I have PCA. I think I inherited it from my mother. Is that likely, or was it just stress? Because I had a very stressful job also.
So I think you can reassure yourself it's very, very unlikely that it is inherited directly. And I think your point about stress is really well taken. One of the cruelest things, there are many, but one of the cruelest things about conditions like PCA is they come on so gradually and insidiously that it's really, really tough to put your finger on what has been the cause. Why have I got this? And to some extent, many of those questions still we can't answer. And I think one of the reasons people come to a group like this is to share in the unfairness of why have I got this and not someone else. But it is possible. There is some research that says there are certain things that we do in life, some of our lifestyle factors and the way we lead, that put us at slight greater risk of dementia, but there's no evidence yet available about what causes PCA at the kind of population level. We just don't know, and so absolutely there should be nothing in your mind that's saying, I blame myself for this, or maybe it's because I was stressed or because of something that happened to me. We don't know, and I think it's more important to focus on what we can do about it now, and you're with friends who will help you to find that way forward. I think that's okay, but let's talk more about lunch as well. One more question before lunch.
Earlier you were doing about seeing how things go in terms of things getting worse or whatever, and you did all those sort of and I remember that you did this quite a few years ago, and at the time they said you might want to decide whether or you want to know about these things happening in those sort of things or not, sort of thing. I noticed this time that you didn't do that. But what I would say on it is the chance of any of us remembering any of those things is going to say.
Thank you. It's a great comment, and we absolutely agree. So one of the reasons why, as a support group community, we decided to try and write down what were some of the stages of PCA was partly because people were naturally asking, what next? When will this happen for me? Or I've met someone else and they've got this particular challenge, will that happen for me too? And typically when you ask that question in a one-to-one doctor's appointment or something, people will say to you, we don't know exactly, it's different for everyone, which is simultaneously completely true, because PCA and other dementias affect everybody differently and progress at different rates, but it's also simultaneously completely unhelpful, because it stops you planning, it stops you thinking. So the agreement with the group after the discussion early on, you're absolutely right, was to say, let's try and describe these stages, but let's not force them down people's throats. Similarly, lots of people, not just with PCA, but with other medical conditions, have been told they've got something, some condition, some diagnosis, and are given like half a tree's worth of paper and fact sheets, and it's totally overwhelming, and you're in shock, and you don't even hear anything that's said to you after the letters PCA. And so what we want to be able to do is have a way, not just for the stages, but for all of the support, information and advice we can try and offer, which allows you to have what you want when you need it and when it's right for you. just, we're all different. Some people, the moment they get that diagnosis, they're on the internet, they want to find out every single thing that might happen, they want chapter and verse. Other people cannot face it and just want to push it away and live each day as it comes. There's no right or wrong with those. What we're just trying to do with the stages is provide that information in a digestible way, so that when you say, I'd like to know a bit more about what next, we've got something to offer you without forcing you to take on more than is right for you at that time. I hope that sounds a reasonable approach.
And we're here sort of for every part of that sort of stage. We have people that come to us straight out of the doctor's surgery, you know, straight away from they come to the clinic, and then people come to us 3 years later and say, actually now I'm ready. And we're not prescriptive, we're not, you've got to have this. It's what suits you and your family at what particular time.
Great. I think there will probably be lots more questions, but for now, can we have one quick round of applause for everyone?
Can I interrupt for just a second? If you're interested in filling out the poetry words, if you could, thank you, Seth. If you could do that now and leave it at the tables around you, and I, on the other team members here, are happy to pick those up. Thank you very much.
Just to let you briefly know what's going to happen now. So now we have lunch, which is in bags and boxes.
They're boxed, so there's meat, fish and vegetarian. They're all very COVID-friendly boxes, so please do help yourself. I think there's one person that asked for gluten-free, so we will try our best to find where the boxes are for you.
And you're very welcome to eat those in that room, to bring them back in here, or to go out into the garden outside and get some fresh air. Please, the questions don't have to stop here. Please feel free to accost anybody you see with your questions. We're all happy to talk to you. And just to say, in about an hour's time, we'll regroup for some small group conversations around these tables. In here, there will be some discussions about research, the impact study, regional groups, direct support needs, and creativity. And next door, there'll be some general informal opportunities to chat and also talk about fundraising and getting involved. But we'll remind you about those at the end of lunch. For now, I hope you've had a good morning. Please come get some food, and do feel free to introduce yourself to as many people as you can.